Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City on this Labor Day weekend. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you especially to our visitors for coming out today. We're just delighted to see you here. If you're visiting with us today, we'd love to invite you to stop by our welcome table in Elliott Hall right after service. Let us introduce ourselves, get to know you a bit as well. If you're joining us online, welcome to you. Please visit our website or our social media channels to learn more about our congregation and how you can get involved. We are singing inside the chapel. I know, it's so exciting. It was so great last week. If singing is not your jam right now, if you're still a little concerned about that, you're welcome to join us in Elliott Hall. That's the designated non-singing area. And you can still watch the whole service and be involved there. And if you're in Elliott Hall and you want to sing, come on in. We got room. I have several announcements as we begin. I even have so many announcements that I had to make an extra cheat sheet. So I hope I get them all. First, our survey. Our congregation-wide survey is the first step for the congregation in seeking our new senior minister. We want every person who's a member of this congregation to take that survey. It's only open until the end of September, so it's really important to do it now, do it before you forget, get that survey sent in. We really appreciate it. You can find it in your Torch email, or you can find it on our website. And thank you. Once again, it's the time of year when we do all of the registrations. If you haven't registered your kids yet for religious education, now is the time. Or register yourself for a small group. This year, our small group ministry is looking at the 8 principles, and it's going to be a really exciting program. We don't want you to miss it. So please do your registrations, and if you need help doing that, you can talk to me after service. We are looking for a few more volunteers to help us staff a booth at the Avenues Street Fair. It's up here in the Avenues, I think I'm not going to say. I can't remember. It's up there. It's this coming Saturday, the 10th, and it's from 9 until 6, so that's a long day. So the more volunteers we have, the shorter of a shift we can work. We also need some people for setting up and breaking down. So if that interests you, talk to me after service. The email you can send to is community@slcuu.org, but if you're like me, you won't remember that. Just come talk to me. I'll set you up. Next week, on September 11th, we will return to 2 worship services, 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. Our worship that day will be intergenerational. There will be no religious education classes, but we will have childcare for the tiny people. We have something special planned. We want everyone to gather on the plaza outdoors. Unless you have special mobility needs and you need help getting sat down inside the chapel. Everybody else, we want you to meet on the plaza, and then we're going to come in. I'm so excited about this, y'all. Okay. After the 11 o'clock service, Religious Education is inviting you to participate in a potluck lunch on the playground. Please bring something to share, and we'll all have lunch together. Then, I'm almost done. September 25th is the Activities Fair. This is our annual event that we have out on the plaza where you can learn about the different ministries and activities of our congregation, learn how you can get involved as a volunteer. And I promised you last week I had a surprise for you, and now I can tell you. We will have a food truck from Spice Kitchen on hand so that you can have some lunch while you look around at the tables, or you can order lunch to take home with you. It's a way to fend off those hungries and support an immigrant small business in our community. So please bring your wallet, bring your volunteer spirit, and enjoy the Activities Fair on the 25th. I didn't even cover everything that's happening at this busy time of year, so make sure that you check your Torch email that comes out on Fridays. It has all the details, all the links, all the forms, all the things. Check it out there. Was that indeed everything? Okay, yes, I think so. Now, let us still our hearts and gather ourselves for the hour of worship. Today we begin with these words by my friend and colleague, the Reverend Elizabeth Mount. To begin, to start, to create, to undertake, to grow, to promise, to increase, to generate. All these are our birthright. As we are created, so may we create. The ability and the choice to create is sacred. To withdraw that chance from any person without their permission would be a violent act, the cutting off of life itself. And yet, as precious is the right to simply not. To end, to terminate, to stop, to discontinue, to rest, to hibernate, to impede, to prevent. These too are our birthright. For without consent, our ability to create becomes not a blessing, but a burden and an imposition. Without space for a no, there cannot be a trustworthy yes. Today we come to this holy place and time ready to invoke the divine, to make space for the sacred, to co-create community once again. This too is a choice. You cannot, you may not be coerced into a relationship with the holy or with one another. I invite you. I ask you to join us. I respect it if you will not, today or ever. More sacred than any other individual need is choice. The right to know oneself, the right to know what you are ready for, what you need, to stretch when you can, to pause when you will, to know your body, your mind, your spirit better than anyone else, and ultimately, to be trusted with the responsibility of your own living. Our opening hymn today is number 298. We will sing 4 verses. There is a 4th. It's a sneaky one. It's up top on the next page. But 4 is enough. We won't sing 5. This morning, we were to have been treated to a word from our first lay preacher of the year, Kristen Quinn. Unfortunately, Kristen is under the weather and unable to join us today. So, I've brought something else for you. The last thing I did this summer, before going on summer break, was to speak at the big Planned Parenthood rally up at the state capitol. It was a privilege to speak on behalf of our congregation about our UU values regarding reproductive justice. I got 2 unexpected responses from community members, which I'd like to share with you as we begin this hour thinking about the subject of reproductive liberty. The first was a very angry email from someone in our community who I've never met and probably never will. The subject line of the email was 49 words long and included the phrase, "You are a cult, not a religion." So, not a fan of Unitarian Universalism. My first feeling upon reading this email was mild alarm, and then something else. The body of the email told a story of pain. The mother of a fallen soldier, a woman unable to afford adequate health care, a survivor of broken relationships, a person who had had an abortion, a person who felt unforgiven and unforgivable. She signed her email, "A child of God," and she is. She is. The other response I received was from a retired OBGYN living here in town who sent me this essay describing her experiences with abortion care over the course of more than 40 years. She first worked as a nurse, working in a surgical ward in the late 1950s, serving mostly women whose lives were at risk due to illegally obtained abortions. Most of what this doctor describes here is much too graphic to share from the pulpit. Just as graphic are her descriptions of serving women seeking abortion care during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. This doctor lays out in detail what is at stake. Is someone watching Zoom in the chapel? I know that's a weird question, but it'll make it echo like that. Tristan, should I switch? No? Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead. This doctor lays out in detail what is at stake if abortions are widely made illegal and unobtainable in our country, or in any country. This doctor made a compelling case for why religious people should support a full range of reproductive care, including birth control and abortion. She wrote about how in the early years after the Roe decision, patients were encouraged to seek the advice of a clergy person as well as that of their doctors, that the religious advice was as important as the medical advice. Another thing that stood out to me from this doctor's essay was that in all her many years of service, she never met a patient who did not take their decision to have an abortion seriously. She decried those who condemned so-called abortion on demand, saying that none of her patients ever pursued abortion as a means of birth control. Pregnancy and birth are risky ventures, even now. Human bodies are fragile, vulnerable to threats of all kinds, and people who can become pregnant are aware of this at a visceral level. Through the decades of navigating changes in healthcare coverage, of increasing physical threats against doctors performing evidence-based medicine, of the ups and downs of court decisions, this doctor witnessed so much heartbreak and death, she clearly felt that her life's work had made a difference to many, and it did. These two responses, taken together, illustrate a critical point about this and other issues in our society. Our moral positions don't appear out of nowhere. They are influenced by our life's experiences. We like to think that we are bringing our best thinking to an issue, and perhaps we are, but we are also bringing all of our experiences and our emotions about our experiences. It's important to remember this when we are hearing someone else's opinion about an issue, that we are likely hearing their pain at least as much as their thinking. How can we listen to a person's emotions with compassion without losing our own sense of what is right? How can we make room for the experiences, perhaps painful and traumatic, that are hovering nearby? How can we be present to another person's grief while also advocating fearlessly for justice? Let us contemplate this as we listen to the music. I invite you now into a spirit of prayer or meditation. Mother God, you are the source of all things. Life emerges from you, new and fresh, and returns to you for recycling when it is spent. No beginning, no end. All things in all things. Life turning back into life, nourishing, rising, falling, beginning again. We bring before you all that is in our hearts. We lament the gloom of this valley, as the freedom to inhabit one's own body without fear of incursion, the freedom to choose the most life-giving path for oneself, the freedom to take responsibility for oneself are all under threat. Love us in our fear. Invite us, Mother, to look far down the path to where the light bends over the horizon. We are not alone. We are not without hope. We are not without resources. We are strong, and we are stronger together. While we are threatened, we cling to one another, and those less threatened reach out to lift up those facing greater danger. Lift us up, Mother, and give us strength to lift up someone else. May it be so. Amen. It is never, ever a bad Sunday when you start with Kate Bush. Ever. At this time, we will collect our offertory. Our congregation is supported entirely by and depends on the regular contributions of its members, friends, and community. Thank you so much for contributing what you can today. If you're using your phone, we have a little card in the pew in front of you. You can use that QR code to go straight to our donation page. Thank you so much. It's been a lovely summer, but it's nice to be back. Last week I told you about some of the serious things I did during the summer, but I also had some fun, and one fun thing that I did was I watched all 4 seasons of Stranger Things on Netflix. 3 times. 3 times. I don't really watch a lot of television, but I watched Stranger Things 3 times. You see, the new season had just come out after a long wait, so I had to go back and watch from the beginning to catch all the details. Then my son wanted to watch it, so we started it over again. And it was just so much fun that we started it one more time, because why not? If you haven't seen it, it's sort of a creepy teen scream series set in the 1980s, and the writers worked in every 80s pop culture reference you can imagine. I grew up in the 80s, and I adore 80s culture, and so every fashion mistake, every hairstyle, every bygone commercial product, New Coke, right, reminded me of my childhood. It was awesome. One might even say it was totally awesome. But the best part of the show for me was all the wonderful 80s pop music that it made up the soundtrack. They even brought back Kate Bush. As a teenager, I was so in love with Kate Bush. Hers were the albums that I played over and over on my cassette player. And I was pretty sure that only Kate Bush and Tori Amos and Björk really understood me. I was a weirdo, a nerd who played the clarinet in the school band and read voraciously. Kafka and Poe and Emily Bronte and Kate Chopin and Doris Lessing. And I was also growing up in fundamentalist Christianity, which wanted me to be well-read, but not to be reading Kate Chopin and Doris Lessing, or listening to Kate Bush and Tori Amos for that matter, because I might get ideas. Like many kids growing up in right-wing Christianity, even today, and like many of you, I had virtually no understanding of how sex worked. The message from my church was, it's wonderful for straight married people, and don't do it. I went to college. I'm not alone. I went to college knowing virtually nothing about birth control or abortion, except what had been drilled into me about it from my church, and that it was legal. Today, I'm a certified sexuality educator in our OWL program, and I do know some things about sex and birth control and abortion. I've also benefited from the right to an abortion. I didn't have an abortion, but I did have a miscarriage. And when my doctor showed me that the fetus I was carrying would not become a baby, I opted to have the very same procedure that people have when they are having an early term abortion, a procedure that is now in legal jeopardy in some places. I was treated with kindness and concern in the hospital. My insurance covered the procedure without so much as a phone call on my end. And most importantly, I was given the choice. My story isn't unusual, nor is it brave. So many women have a story like this. 1 in 4 women have had an abortion at some time in their life, and 10 to 15% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, also known as spontaneous abortion. Virtually everyone knows someone with a story like this, whether we know that we know or not. For a few years now, I've had a file open on my computer called The Hardest Sermon I'll Ever Preach. It was a sermon about abortion rights. Why was it the hardest? Well, for several reasons. For one, I was making the common mistake of thinking that this debate hinged on our differing definitions of when life begins. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Many Christians believe that life begins at conception, but the Christian scriptures actually say nothing about it. And the Hebrew scriptures, on which Christianity was partially based, condones abortion and actually gives instructions for how and when ancient people could perform one. Jewish traditions mostly allow abortions, as for Jews, life begins at the first breath. And Islam also allows some abortions. Buddhism, Hinduism, all of the world's major religions make some room for abortion. The question of when life begins and the depth of one's commitment to a religion just don't predict whether a person will support the right to an abortion. And really, does life ever begin or end? Isn't life a circle of constantly arising and falling away, becoming something, then becoming something else? Isn't this a question for philosophy, not science or the law? How do we define life anyway? It's an especially fraught question in a society that seems to worship death, that thinks so little of life on earth, and invests so much in an afterlife which remains unknown and isn't guaranteed. In a society that still executes human beings for their crimes and has some of the highest infant and maternal mortality rates among wealthy nations and leads the world in child poverty, the world. How does America define life? Another reason is that one of the most important responsibilities of a preacher is to lead people away from the shallow comfort of simple answers and toward the complexity of real life. While 85% of Americans support the right to an abortion in some or all cases, that support changes a lot depending on the circumstances. While 73% say abortion should be legal if a woman's health is at stake, and 69% if the pregnancy was a result of rape or incest, just over half said it should be legal if the baby was likely to be born with severe disabilities or health issues. And support for abortion care drops precipitously the longer a pregnancy has gone on. Abortion is a moral issue, and people wrestle with it in different ways. Now, it's said that over 90% of Unitarian Universalists support abortion access in most or all cases, and yet we don't all think in lockstep. Some of that diversity is in this room, but we don't talk about it. And one of the reasons we don't talk about it is because this issue has become so polarizing. Despite the fact that polls demonstrate this wide variety of opinions and beliefs, we would be led to believe that there are exactly two opinions. Either abortion is always right or it's always wrong. When we let ourselves be carried along by polarized thinking, we shrink human beings into two-dimensional creatures. We may think we know who is getting an abortion and why. We tell ourselves stories about the kind of person who would get an abortion, which makes it easy to forget that each of these people is an individual with their own story and their own reasons, which are none of our business. We may also think we know who is opposing abortion and why. We forget that they also have stories to tell. And that leads to the biggest reason why I thought it would be so hard to preach about abortion. I could spend a whole hour, never mind the 20 minutes of a sermon, talking about all the real-life situations a person might face, and after an hour, we might not have scratched the surface. Women who had abortions to save their own lives. Women who had abortions because they couldn't afford any alternative. Women who had abortions because they were in abusive relationships. Women who couldn't get an abortion for the exact same reason. Women who had abortions because they had their eyes on a future. Women who felt elated or relieved. Women who have carried the guilt for decades. Women who could never have children and felt resentful of women who could get pregnant. Women who have kept their abortions secret from their families, even from their spouse. Women who were shunned by their families for having an abortion. Women who chose adoption and were shamed. Adopted children who resent their birth mothers or their adoptive mothers or both. Teenagers who were made to have abortions against their will. Disabled people robbed of the right to even express their choices. Women of color who were sterilized against their will as late as 1963. 1963. People who lost their mothers during childbirth. People who lost their children to abortions that were illegal. Transgender men who face extraordinary discrimination, even violence when they need abortion care and are too often forgotten in this debate. And even still, we haven't named all the stories. Some of these stories are present in this room. How could I preach this topic and leave out even one? How could I possibly make sure that every person with a story felt seen and heard? How would I feel knowing one person had left our worship service feeling unsafe and ashamed? Every time I sat down to work on this sermon, I would write myself into a corner. It was just too complex. There were too many angles. I needed 5 Sundays to work it all out. I felt that I would bungle it no matter what I did. Then in June, the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, which had secured our right to an abortion for 50 years. And suddenly, things got very simple. And isn't that how it always goes? A problem can be so complex in the abstract, but when it takes concrete form, it becomes so simple. Lives are at risk. Lives are at risk. Women's lives, babies' lives, trans folks' lives, the lives of people of color are especially at risk. The lives of poor folks, especially those without access to birth control or health care. And cisgender men, this is your issue too, because people that you're close to are at risk. Roe versus Wade was built on a legal assertion to the right to privacy in a person's body. And now that it's overturned, all sorts of privacy issues are up for grabs. Can trans people still get access to life-saving, gender-affirming treatment? Can gay couples remain married with all the privileges of marriage? Can they protect their children? Can doctors do their duty to their patients without fear of retribution? We've heard these scary scenarios described in the media, and we are right to be worried. If you haven't taken action to protect your families, now's the time. Get your documents in order, have some plan B stocked away in a drawer. I do. But there's even more to it than that. What's simple for me is that human bodies do not belong to the state. Babies don't belong to the state. Uteruses do not belong to the state. Workers' bodies do not belong to the state. We belong to the earth. The state exists to serve the people. The people may serve each other. That's the basis of community. But we do not exist to serve the state. Our bodies belong only to ourselves, and we must have complete sovereignty over them. That might seem obvious, but in the military-industrial complex in which we live, it is not obvious at all. The movements for labor and for prison and police reform have shown us for 2 centuries now that whatever autonomy we have over our own bodies, we have to fight for it. The right to be safe in our homes and on our streets, the right to refuse military service, the right to be safe at work, the right to health care, and even the right to die on our own terms. What makes this kind of sovereignty possible in a democratic society is the truth that not everyone will make the same choices we will. We have to trust them anyway. Those who would restrict abortion fundamentally do not trust people to make the right decisions for their own lives, families, and bodies. Our society has never trusted women and those in gender and sexual minorities to be sovereign over themselves. To find oneself pregnant is to receive a call to take responsibility for one's own life, for another potential life, as well as all the other lives in community with their life. To have an abortion is the same. No matter what a person believes about when life begins, the decision to have an abortion challenges us to face our beliefs and take responsibility for them. And our society is deeply allergic to allowing women to take responsibility for anything. Our society is especially allergic to allowing women to take responsibility for the dance of life and death. Yet powerful people, still mostly men, engage in life and death decisions all the time through war, incarceration, police brutality, cruel lawmaking, domestic violence. And how rarely are they held to account? If our society could really trust women and trans folks to hold life in their hands and be fully responsible for it and support them in every step, what a different world we would live in. To be able to prevent every unwanted pregnancy with free birth control and childcare and trauma healing and healthy relationships. To trust every person who's seeking an abortion that they know what they're doing and they can do it without being made to feel ashamed. That the gravity of their decision is honored and cherished. That the children who are born into this world are loved and wanted deeply, and their parents are supported richly while carrying the burden of parenthood. that every human body is treated compassionately, recognizing the wholeness of personhood and the never-ending cycle of life and death in which all our bodies turn again and again. I've never been that comfortable with the framing of this debate with the word choice. It's always sounded like choosing a breakfast cereal or something. Some decisions are bigger than that. But I'm also deeply uncomfortable with framing anti-abortion as a pro-life stance. There's nothing pro-life about taking healthcare options away from women, queer folks, and families. I'm pro-life and pro-liberation, giving every person every possible option to move to where there's the most life available. Sometimes that's toward abortion. Abortion is a life-giving option for millions of people, and everyone should have access to it. And that's the easiest sermon I'll ever preach. Amen. We need to sing. I need to sing. Before we rise, I invite you, though, to have a mindful moment about this hymn. It's one of my favorites, but it was written in the 1950s before very many people understood that there are more than two genders. I don't think we have to cancel the hymn, but there's always a way to draw the circle wider and make room for more love and more inclusion. So I invite you, we're going to sing the 4 verses. On the 3rd verse, instead of every leader, would you sing every person? And then we make room for all the gender possibilities that don't fit into this binary. Now, I invite you to rise and sing with me number 1026. It's in your teal hymnal.
Everyone
Please be seated. At 11:30 today, if you'd like, we invite you to stay for a meeting to learn more about how our congregation is hoping to get involved in this effort. We'll be meeting up in 201, right?
At the Haven.
In the Haven, okay. It's behind me up the stairs in this building. We're going to have Annabelle Shine from Planned Parenthood, who's going to come and talk with us a little bit about some options. We're going to brainstorm, probably not starting something today, but talking about the possibilities and where we might go from here. For now, our worship is ended. Our service now begins. May we go forth today to take responsibility for our decisions, to honor the decisions of others, to make all the options possible, to create liberation and justice in a spirit of compassion. May we have our eyes set on freedom. Amen.